Thank you so much, Barbara, for having us, for having all the members of Congress and all of the panelists here. Thank you to Joel, and thank you so much, Congressman Conyers, for being here. It's incredible to think that you were in the House in 1965 when Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. So thank you for all you've done for this Congress. I just want to share my brief journalistic perspective of covering this election through the lens of voting rights, and it's been clear whether you look at North Carolina or Arizona or New York, that the 2016 primary has showed that American democracy is profoundly broken. The erosion of voting rights is the most important yet least discussed story of the 2016 election, because this is the first presidential election since the Supreme Court has gutted the Voting Rights Act, and the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. What that means is that 17 states have new voting restrictions in place for the first time in 2016, including crucial swing states like North Carolina and Wisconsin. As we've heard, these include laws making it harder to register to vote, cutting back on the amount of time that people have to vote, and requiring strict forms of ID that 16 million registered Americans don't have. Yet so many colleagues of mine in the media continue to treat the gutting of voting rights as a fringe issue rather than one of the most fundamental issues in the election. There have been 21 presidential debates, but not a single question about voting rights. Despite the fact that the Voting Rights Act is the most important piece of American civil rights legislation. Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act 4 times, in 1970, in 1975, in 1982, and in 2006. The 4 reauthorizations were passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, and each reauthorization was signed by a Republican president. Every time there was an effort to weaken the law, but the final bill emerged stronger than before. But there has also been a 50-year effort to try to roll back the Voting Rights Act and try to roll back the gains of the civil rights movement. The revolution of 1965 spawned an equally committed counter-revolution. Chief Justice John Roberts, for example, has been trying to weaken the Voting Rights Act for 3 decades, ever since he was a young lawyer in the Reagan Justice Department, where he wrote memo after memo arguing that violations of the Voting Rights Act should not be made, quote, too easy to prove. That's what he did in the Shelby County decision when he gutted the Voting Rights Act. And as a result of that decision, many new voting restrictions have gone into effect. We heard about what's happening in Texas, where you can vote with a handgun permit and not a student ID. We've heard about what's happening in North Carolina, where they passed the most restrictive anti-voting law since 1965. We heard about what's happening in Arizona, where there are 5-hour lines because Maricopa County eliminated 70% of its polling places. We saw what happened in New York, my home state, this very week, where there were major problems at the polls, including 126,000 registered Democrats purged from the rolls in Brooklyn. Many people don't realize that Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx were also covered under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act because those counties had an English-only literacy test in place as of 1968 and very low minority turnout. So a thing like a voter purge in Brooklyn also would have been reviewed under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, but was not reviewed because the law is gutted. I want to tell you a story from Wisconsin where I reported for the April 5th primary. Wisconsin had a strict voter ID law, which 300,000 registered voters did not have the right ID for. They eliminated early voting on nights and weekends when it's most convenient to vote, and they made it practically impossible to do grassroots voter registration drives. The story that I want to tell you about is about a man by the name of Eddie Lee Holloway Jr., and I think it illustrates the problems that voters are facing at the polls in 2016. Holloway was a 58-year-old African-American man who moved from Illinois to Wisconsin in 2008 and voted without problems until Wisconsin passed its voter ID law in 2011. I never miss voting, he said. He brought his Illinois photo ID, his birth certificate, and his Social Security card to the polls to get an ID for voting. But the DMV rejected his application because his birth certificate read Eddie Jr. Holloway instead of Eddie Lee Holloway Jr., the result of a clerical error when it was issued. So he was sent downtown to the Vital Records Department in Milwaukee. The Vital Records Department said it would cost between $400 and $600 for him to amend his birth certificate. He was disabled and unemployed and living with his mother and sister at the time in Milwaukee. Nonetheless, he paid $180 to go from Milwaukee to Illinois, where he was born, to visit the Vital Records Department in Springfield, the state capital of Illinois. When he went to the Vital Records Department in Springfield, he was told that he would need to bring his vaccination records and his high school records to be able to amend his birth certificate. So he went from Springfield, Illinois, the capital, to Decatur, Illinois, where he was born, to get his high school records. He went back to Springfield with his high school records. They said that he needed his full Social Security statement, which he didn't have. So after paying $180 for a bus ticket and traveling 4 hours round trip, he had to go back to Milwaukee without the documents he needed. He then got 2 copies of his Social Security statement, and he asked if he could fax or email them over to the Illinois Vital Records Department. They said no. He'd have to go back to Illinois to appear in person. At that point, he did not have $100, $200 for another bus ticket, and he gave up. The net effect is that this man, Eddie Lee Holloway Jr., brought 3 IDs to the polls, spent $200, visited 2 states, and made 7 trips to different public institutions, but still couldn't vote in Wisconsin. This despite the fact that Wisconsin didn't present a single case of voter impersonation in court to justify its voter ID law. In fact, you're more likely to be struck by lightning than you are to impersonate another voter at the polls. So I think it's really important when governors like Scott Walker say that voter ID laws are working, quote, just fine, that we remind them of these kind of stories. That when House Judiciary Committee Chairman Bob Goodlatte says that a weakened Voting Rights Act is still providing, quote, very, very strong protections, that we remind him of disenfranchised voters like Eddie Lee Holloway Jr. The last thing I'll say is that not only does Congress have the power to strengthen the Voting Rights Act, they've done it before. In 1980, the Supreme Court, in a case called Mobile versus Bolden, ruled that a discriminatory election system could only be overturned under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, the remaining part of the Voting Rights Act, if voters presented evidence of intentional discrimination, which was nearly impossible to prove. It was the greatest setback to the Voting Rights Act at the time. But during the 1982 reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, Democrats like Ted Kennedy joined forces with Republicans like Bob Dole to strengthen the law. The House held field hearings in Alabama and Texas, hearing firsthand stories of voter disenfranchisement. And critics of the Voting Rights Act, like Republican Congressman Henry Hyde of Illinois, became supporters. The right to vote is the crown jewel of American liberties, Ronald Reagan said when he signed the 1982 reauthorization of the law. We will not see its luster diminished. If the Voting Rights Act can be strengthened when Ronald Reagan was president and Strom Thurmond was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, it can be strengthened again today. Thank you.